Perhaps the biggest accomplishment of the Communist Party of Cuba is existing in the modern day, outliving Yugoslavia, the Berlin Wall, the Khmer Rouge, the Eastern European system, any practical sense of communism in China and Vietnam, and yeah, the Soviet Union. And it did this while its capital was only 100 miles away from communism's biggest hater. Meanwhile, just across on the Floridian tip, a thriving Cuban community grew to be the engine of South Florida, propelling Miami to be dubbed the capital of Latin America. I think you can make a case that Cuba's Communist Party survived not in spite of being so close to the US, but because of it. And you can make a case that South Florida has thrived not in spite of the Castro regime, but also partly because of it. The two regions have a weird symbiotic relationship with each other, keeping one Cuba as an orthodox Marxist state and the other Cuba as, well, Vice City.
Part 356 of how much I make as a bottle girl in, I always say Miami, but it's really Fort Lauderdale.
But when Cuba was first independent, it was nowhere near communist. It was democratic, sure, but its politics was dominated by strongmen, and it was a market economy, sure, but that market was dominated, like most ex-Spanish colonies, by a handful of wealthy land-owning families which got rich off of Cuba's historical cash crop, sugar. To not be dependent on this addictive white powder forever, the Cuban government took advantage of one of the most important assets it had: how close it was to rich, conservative Americans. The country was a hub of what Miami is a hub of now: clubs, beaches, casinos, brothels, and especially during Prohibition, alcohol. Basically, a playground for American tourists. To the ex-president Fulgencio Batista, beautiful women were his solution to save the economy after a sugar shock, so you could tell what type of dogs he hung around. His government grew to be so unpopular that it's played a massive role in keeping the current Cuban regime alive. Maybe it was because he kept his face around for 25 years and the people just got sick of him, but it's more likely that it was the, murder, torture, secret police, and suspension of democracy. He faced two groups of organized resistance during his dictator phase. One was a principled Marxist-Leninist group, the PSP, which would take Cuba by storm through, books and speeches and pamphlets. Nerds. The other was a revolutionary party, kinda just for the sake of revolution. It wasn't Marx which inspired these guys, but Jose Marti, a poet who played a key role in gearing Cuba towards independence from the Spanish and setting it apart from the US. This sect was led by a young Fidel Castro. A letter to President Roosevelt asking to see a $10 bill because he'd never seen one before. Ironically, he also invited the US government to come check out Cuba's iron supply and take some if they're running low. They sent the letter back, but with no $10 bill, and I like to think this is when Fidel got radicalized against the US government and imperialism. But the truth is that Cubans were never too fond of Americans, even before the revolution. According to communism historian Archie Brown, anti-Americanism was stronger in Cuba than anywhere else in Latin America. Fidel then went to university and got really into politics, going on to lead a group of opponents to the Batista regime by attempting to storm the Moncada fortress, where many in his group were hunted down, jailed, or killed. He escaped though, starting a life of what is perhaps the most time somebody should have died, but didn't. He was really proud of this fact, eventually ordering the Havana Museum to make a display of all the foiled attempts to kill him. Of the 15 years in jail he was supposed to serve for this raid, he only did 1.5 before Batista released him, in fear that he would look like too much of a dictator if he kept him locked up after elections. Bad idea for him, cause Fidel then fled to Mexico, announcing publicly he would come back one day with intention to get rid of this government. In Mexico City, Fidel's brother Raul introduced him to a young doctor named Che Guevara. Raul and Che would be the more left-wing characters behind the revolution, and Fidel's personal relationship with them would be a huge factor in the revolution turning into a communist one. That revolution started when they sailed from Mexico back to Cuba, famously botching the landing, almost dying again, nearly being captured by the army and fleeing into the Sierra Maestra Mountains to start a 2-year-long guerrilla war campaign. Batista reported that this rebel died several times throughout the war, but Castro would appear in interviews, radio programs, and a jeep touring around the country to gather up support and territory. 1 year in, the rebels captured Santiago, the country's second largest city, and on January 1st, 1959, Batista finally fled to the Dominican Republic, taking nearly all of the country's gold and dollar reserves with him and his goons. Even before he officially became president, everyone recognized Castro as the guy in charge of Cuba now. He was still adamant that this wasn't a communist movement, but 2 years later, just before the Bay of Pigs invasion, he finally declared himself a Marxist-Leninist in one of his marathon speeches. It's not confirmed why he decided to join the League of Socialist Nations. It was probably a mix of his anti-Americanism, his own admiration for these revolutions, and, like many ex-members of his government have theorized, to get aid and weapons from the Soviets. Like that famous time they put missiles on his island and almost caused World War III, but really, he didn't want them there, and this did a lot to strain Cuban-Soviet relations. More helpful to him was the Soviet decision to buy all of Cuba's sugar supply for 7 times the world price, essentially subsidizing the government, which they could use to buy Soviet oil and arms. And as they got involved, his government got more and more Soviet-looking. Castro's agricultural agency, the INRA, radically redistributed land, even expropriating his own family's estates. Critical newspapers and TV stations were shut down, people who could threaten his rule were eliminated, and many people were arbitrarily detained, even Manuel Urrutia, who served as the first president after the revolution under the guise of being anti-revolution. When Fidel truly became Cuba's Máximo Líder, he would play a bigger role in what they called the moral economy. Of course, casinos and casino-adjacent industries were shut down, but American businesses were also kicked out with their assets seized, tens of thousands of small businesses were seized and nationalized, and people were pushed into where him and Che wanted production to be. Oftentimes, command economies reflect the personal preferences of their country's leaders, which can result in uneven development across the economy. A YouTube famous example was Fidel's program to create a super breed of milk cow because he personally loved dairy and ice cream. But a more substantial example would be that Cuba excelled in areas like healthcare and education, practically eliminating illiteracy and ending up with the highest percentage of doctors on Earth, yet they lagged far behind in most sectors, especially of consumer goods, even at times neglecting its own cash crop. Once, at the very start of this new government, they attempted to reduce the amount of land dedicated to growing sugar, but even Che admitted that that was a, quote, big mistake,
gran error,
and a fetishistic idea,
idea fetichista,
ending in a farming disaster because they personally saw sugar as a symbol of American imperialism. So already we can see some reasons why the Cuban Communist Party has been able to last so much longer than the Soviets. It was a self-made, rather than Russian-imposed revolution to get rid of an insanely unpopular government. Fidel was very personally popular, and it was isolated from the rest of the Eastern Bloc. But 2 other reasons both have to do with this country: embargoes and emigration. Fidel Castro, unlike many other communist leaders, would allow waves of disaffected Cubans to leave the country. Where? Who knows? He didn't care. They weren't his Cubans. This kind of acted like a pressure release valve so that the most angry citizens could direct their energy into fleeing rather than trying to take down the government. In the decade after the revolution, an estimated 400,000 people left the island. One wave in 1980 saw 125,000 people leave in boats, rafts, and tubes from Mariel Harbor. Castro even forced many prisoners to join this exodus, proving he really did think throwing his undesirables away was a good strategy to keep Cuba pure. Many of them went to Spanish-speaking countries, but most went to the US, and in particular, Florida. The biggest wave has actually been since 2020, when the Nicaraguan government loosened visa requirements for Cubans. 500,000 came to the US, mostly up through Central America, crossing the Mexican border. After the capture of Havana in 1959, entire layers of the old Cuban elite fled to Florida, laying the foundations for what would become modern Miami. Before that, Tampa was the hub of Florida. Can you believe that? Tampa? American governments welcomed these refugees, with the county giving them $35 million, then $72 million in the first 2 years after the revolution, and the federal government passing the Cuban Adjustment Act in 1966, which allowed Cuban immigrants to apply for citizenship after only 1 year of living in America, giving them a special sort of status that lasted throughout the Cold War. One of the things most of the immigrants can agree on is that the American government should promote regime change in Cuba. Every demographic, even American-born Cubans, supports this idea. The American government's official policy is to embargo Cuba, blocking trade of most goods to the island. According to the Cuban government, causing over $150 billion in losses. The only things America officially trades with the island are food, medicine, and humanitarian goods. Everything else shouldn't have a Made in the USA sticker on it. Yet most Cuban Americans also believe the US hasn't done enough. I mean, the embargo's gone on for over 6 decades. You'd think it would work by now if decreasing the island's material standard of living would actually make people want to overthrow their government. And this is one of the reasons why Cuban Americans are, on average, so Republican. Nearly 70% of Cubans did, in fact, vote for Donald Trump in 2024. Cuban Americans are at their peak of political power, with people like Marco Rubio playing a key role in America's latest right-wing revolution. He happens to be the highest-ranking Secretary of State since Henry Kissinger. You can guess his personal opinions on Cuba's communist government, too.
And he was going to start this group to go on college campuses and try to convince young Americans that ours is the greatest country in the history of the world and that Marxism was bad. I'm going to admit to you guys, I was a little skeptical. I said, college campuses, you're going to do that? Why don't you start somewhere easier, like, for example, Communist Cuba, you know?
And Fidel Castro's own daughter is an anti-communist radio host in Miami. His grandson is actually an influencer of his own back home, but he's a little more of a stereotypical trust fund kid.
La disquera se va a llamar Castro Record. ¿Cómo? Castro Record.
If a trust fund was actually a dictatorship of the proletariat or something. One of the reasons people like Sandro can live the life he does is through remittances, money sent back home. Over 90% of Cuban remittance senders live in America, sending an average of around $2,400 per year. Since America has capped legal remittances to only $300 every 3 months, most are actually sent through informal money mules, who just transport the physical cash over the Strait of Florida. About 70% of Cubans receive remittances, relying on them to buy goods and even operate their businesses, where businesses can be operated. If you're truly an elite Cuban, you just operate your business in Miami. Around the 70s and 80s, the city truly became global when it hit over 1 million people. One of the reasons why is because it's been an oasis of peace in an otherwise unstable region. That is, if you consider Miami part of Latin America, which, considering over 70% of the city speaks Spanish, you can make a good case for. Nearly half of American trade with Latin America and the Caribbean is done through Miami's Biscayne Bay. It's the Latin American capital of banking and finance, and through successive waves of migration, over a third of Miami-Dade County is now Cuban. Entire sections of the city look like they were copy-pasted from the island. Little Havana, of course, but also places like Westchester, Coral Terrace, and Hialeah, which, according to my Miami accomplice Rick Ross, celebrated when Fidel died.
Hialeah celebrated when Fidel died. Patty LaBelle, who knew
As dumb as it might sound, Rick Ross is honestly a good symbol of Miami culture, which has been heavily shaped by opposition to communist rule. Through and through, Miamians are hustlers.
I now own a casino. I repeat.
What you're looking at right now is the next chapter in the cosmos. You go to Home Depot and you go get me the biggest saw there is with a big chain. I'm gonna cut the trees down.
Being the first to embrace the newest economic inventions in America,
Cruz putting the final touches on the Bitcoin 2021 convention, the world's largest cryptocurrency conference.
even being a potential competitor to Wall Street.
Now, having said that, Miami, I think, represents the future of America. And I really do believe there are very important lessons for America from the good governance that you see here in the state of Florida.
I'm sure the large Cuban population who are quite distrustful of government forces have played a role in enabling Miami to be the hyper-capitalist city it is today. But if you look back at modern-day Cuba, and I know people have been predicting the collapse of the regime since 1991, it really does look extra shaky these days. Although Fidel grew old and frail, his larger-than-life personality kept the revolution going, although with less and less enthusiasm as the decades went on. Then, when health problems got too much for him, Raul Castro stepped in, opening up a little with public rumbles from his brother, until the first non-Castro took charge in 2021. By then, the vast majority of Cubans had no memory of life before the revolution, and the only leaders they knew were Castro's. President Miguel Diaz-Canel's administration has gone through a bit of a privatization period after the pandemic, with small businesses now employing more than the government. Though economic power just ended up concentrated in the military's hands. An arm of the military, GISA, which stands for, get this, Business Administration Group Inc., is estimated to control about 37% of Cuba's production. Most importantly, its resorts and hotels, but also much of its transportation networks, gas stations, supermarkets, real estate, construction, banks, and foreign exchange, aka the remittance industry. A report by the Miami Herald suggested GISA held around $18 billion in assets, making it far, far more solvent than the Cuban government itself. Or, as another way to look at it, making triple the income of the state. This group can't be held accountable by the Cuban government. It's almost as if a parallel state is forming under a different set of rules, one the country can't monitor. Meanwhile, the starved Cuban state is going through the worst crisis in probably its entire history. Since 2021, 20% of the entire island has left the country. That's an unprecedented migration even by Cuban standards. And it hollowed the country out of workers as many skilled Cubans either left or went into more easily adjustable paying jobs like driving taxis or working on resorts for tourists. At the same time, the end of the dual currency system, which let Cubans use either Cuban pesos or US dollars, they usually chose dollars, devalued its currency sharply, leading to an insane price increase in imported goods, food, and fuel. The government officially reported an inflation rate of 200% in 2023, but some estimates put it as high as 500%. And, to top it all off, their oil line to Venezuela has dried up, leaving the country literally starved of fuel. Daily blackouts are a common occurrence, pork, rice, and bean production have halved, hospitals ran out of supplies, 7 out of 10 Cubans are reported to skip meals, bicycles and horse carts have become more useful than cars in the countryside, and tourism, the one saving grace, hasn't recovered since COVID. In an ironic twist, Cuba has actually started importing sugar because its ability to produce it has fallen so dramatically. Maybe Mexico will step in to carry out their fuel needs, but definitely not the world's largest oil producer, and certainly not while little Marco is Secretary of State. Only 8% of Cubans actually see America's embargo as the main cause for state breakdown. While mass protests directed at their own government have broken out since 2021, at the extremes, calling for the end of it. That could be the finale of the two-Cuba system, but it could also come from the American side, particularly with the back and forth flip-flopping over Cubans' special protections in the US. Between the American administrations, Cubans can expect to be granted into the US on a humanitarian basis or not, depending on if the government is red or blue, and the same thing for normalizing relations or designating Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. The current color wants a total pressure embargo, and some Miami exiles want a total ban on travel and remittances to the country. The special provisions allowing many Cubans into the US were, flipped, making them susceptible to deportation. And yet, the Cuban government refuses to take any exiles back. Kicking Cubans out and refusing to accept Cuban migrants could ironically do more damage to the Cuban government than the genuine attempts America has been trying for decades. But at the risk of killing the second Cuba in South Florida. Subscribe. If you don't, I'll kill you. And watch this.